She stepped onto the gravel path with boots that had seen better days and a duffel that looked too heavy for her frame. Her shadow stretched across the dirt like a challenge to the morning sun, and every step she took echoed against the laughter that rippled from the group ahead, a cluster of men all hardened and seasoned by months of field work and drills, their faces set in grins that were anything but friendly, their eyes scanning her like she was another joke in a long line of tryhards and washouts. She didn't meet their gaze, didn't flinch as she approached the firing line and stood before the racks of rifles, each one gleaming in the dim light of the overcast sky. She reached for the M24 without hesitation, fingers moving, with muscle memory as if she'd been born holding it. And that was when the laughter shifted tone, almost confused, almost uncertain, but still loud enough to sting. The instructor leaned in close, grizzled and gray with a voice like crushed gravel, and asked her if she even knew what she was doing, if she had any clue what it meant to touch that rifle, let alone fire it. He gestured to the target downrange, barely visible through the morning mist, a speck of black hanging in the distance like a dare. And she simply nodded, once her face unreadable and calm, her silence more cutting than any insult she could have thrown back. She lay prone on the mat, adjusted the bipod, flicked the safety, and nestled into position as if the rifle were part of her body. Not a tool, not a weapon, but a limb. Long lost and recently returned. The instructor backed off with a shake of the head and muttered something the others couldn't quite catch, something that made even the bravest of them narrow their eyes just slightly. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm of something not taught in any manual, not practiced on any range. It was the kind of calm that only came from standing on the edge of something final, the kind of silence that lives in the pause. Between lightning and thunder, she exhaled once, then again, and when the third breath came, it never left her lungs. Instead, it became the shot that ripped through the stillness like a scream masked in steel. And when the bullet found its home, the silence that followed was almost violent. The target downrange quivered once, then split dead center, the kind of shot that wasn't lucky, wasn't hopeful, wasn't a guess. It was an answer one forged in the darkest parts of the world where instinct meant survival and hesitation meant death. The group behind her didn't cheer, didn't speak, some exchanged glances. Others stared at the broken target like it had betrayed them, like it had lied about how hard it was to hit her spotter. A tall, wiry man with scars running like rivers across his forearms crouched beside her. Slowly, he didn't say a word until she ejected the spent casing and looked up at him, her eyes reflecting nothing but clouds. Then he whispered something, a name maybe, or a warning, or maybe something that only made sense to her because she nodded and returned to her stance without ever acknowledging the others, who now watched her not as a peer or an equal, but as a question, one they weren't sure they wanted answered. Later, that day when the drills resumed and the air was filled with the scent of cordite and sweat, she moved like a ghost from station to station. Her form flawless, her aim unerring. Every shot, another confession written in lead, every pause between reloads. A reminder that she had not come here to prove anything, only to reclaim something. The instructors stopped correcting her. They stopped challenging her. They began watching her with a kind of quiet discomfort. Not because she was perfect, but because perfection had always come with a price, and no one could see what she was paying to achieve it. No one knew why her hands never shook, or why she never blinked when others flinched at the roar of recoil at night. She sat alone on the edge of the camp, facing the dark trees that surrounded the perimeter, her rifle across her lap like a loyal dog, eyes scanning the shadows with an intensity that suggested she expected something to come out. Expected a threat, not from paranoia but from certainty. Like she had been in places where things crawled from darkness without warning, and the only way to stay alive was to never stop listening to the silence. One of the men approached her once, thinking maybe to talk, maybe to ask how she made those shots, but he stopped 10 feet away and turned back without a word. as if some invisible boundary had risen around her, a line not drawn by fear but by reverence or something deeper, something unspoken. Every morning she was first to the range, and every evening the last to leave. She never smiled, never complained, and never missed. No one knew where she was from. Not really, the file said Midwest, some farm town most had never heard of, but her eyes told a different story. The kind of story carved into the bones of people who had seen too much and lived anyway. The M24 that others respected, she carried like a secret, like something that had chosen her as much as she had chosen it, and when she cleaned it, she did so with the care of someone, tending to a wound not with the detachment of routine, but with the precision of ritual. The senior instructor started keeping notes not on her aim or her drills, but on her behavior, on her patterns, on the way the others had stopped mocking her, not out of shame, but out of some instinctive shift in the air around her. He had seen soldiers before, seen killers, seen natural-born warriors, but this was different. This was like watching a shadow learn how to walk in daylight and still remain unseen. He wrote in his notebook one line that he never explained, even when questioned by higher ranks. She doesn't belong here, but she is exactly where she needs to be. Then came the test, not on paper, not scheduled, a surprise exercise sprung on them at dawn. Full gear, full kit, hostile sim in the nearby woods, 3 hours of chaos and calculated stress. And while others fumbled and regrouped, she vanished before the first marker was even called, crossed into the trees without hesitation, without speaking. As if she had been waiting for this moment since the day she arrived, she moved like the forest knew her name, like the ground chose not to betray her location. And within 20 minutes her team had all been marked safe, while the opposing force wondered where the hell the shots were coming from, and why none of them ever missed. That night the debrief was silent. Her squad looked at her with the kind of respect that only came from shared survival, the kind that didn't need words, the kind born in the moments between life and death. And as the instructor closed the file with her name on it, he glanced toward the door where she had already vanished back into the night, back to wherever she kept the pieces of herself that refused to be seen, and muttered to no one in particular. This one, she's not just another sniper. She's the kind you call when the mission doesn't exist. By the third week, she was no longer just another name on the roster. She was a presence, a shadow cast, over the firing line, and the field and the whispers that followed her were no longer cruel jokes, but quiet speculations. Even the loudest men had learned not to speak when she walked by. Not because she demanded it, but because something about her demanded silence, a kind of gravity that pulled attention without effort. She led the board now shot for shot, kill for kill, her name written in chalk above all others with no flair, no underline, just cold fact. And that unnerved them more than if she had celebrated, because she never did. She only cleaned her rifle and waited for the next shot. They tested her in ways they had never tested anyone before. They changed drills mid-exercise. They shifted wind variables and distances without warning. They replaced live targets with metal ones that shimmered under sun and confused even experienced eyes. They loosened her scope mounting by just a thread, sabotaged her zeroing by a fraction of an inch, but none of it changed anything. She adjusted, with movements that seemed automatic, her hands moving before her mind, like her body knew something. Her brain no longer questioned, and the instructors stopped looking at her like a student and began watching her like a problem they couldn't solve. She spoke only when necessary, and even then her words were measured like bullets. Not wasted, not thrown out, but placed with precision, the kind that didn't invite conversation, but closed it. Her squad had grown used to her silence and had stopped trying to fill it. They followed her now in drills, without question, not out of obedience, but because something in her movements, something in the way she paused before corners or scanned windows or ducked beneath broken branches, told them. She saw things they did not, and they knew enough not to question the vision of someone who always seemed to be looking further than the rest. It was during a routine recon drill that everything changed. A simulated patrol through a nearby wooded area, timed, graded, observed by instructors through drones and infrared. But something went wrong. Something they would later claim was a miscommunication, but she would never accept that a real threat entered the field. Unknown hostile signatures, moving through the trees, fast, trained, not insurgents, not locals, something else, something that shouldn't have been there. And when the alarm went up and the base scrambled for order, she was already gone, already moving, already hunting. They tried to track her on the drone, but she vanished into the underbrush, like smoke dissolving under moonlight. Her infrared signature lost, as if she had dropped her gear. But she hadn't. She had just moved low and quiet, and fast, too fast for standard gear. To track her path traced only by the absence of sound, where there should have been birds rustling leaves or breath. She reappeared once on satellite for half a second atop a ridge, crouched, rifle raised, eyes locked on something the feed didn't catch, and then gone again. The first hostile went down with no sound, just a body falling knees first, then face forward before even his partner knew he was dead. The second dropped seconds later, shot through the temple from a different angle, suggesting impossible movement or two shooters. But it was only her and the M24 both moving, like they had one soul. The third fired back, a burst of panic more than accuracy. But the bullets hit only trees and wet dirt. And then he too fell, one shot to the throat just as he turned to run. Not fast enough. Never. Fast enough. When the QRF arrived, they found 5 bodies spaced across a half-mile. No footprints, no casings, no signs of struggle. Each kill clean, clinical, efficient, too efficient for standard rules of engagement, too efficient for training. Even the commander who stepped onto the field, the one they called Ghostblade for reasons no one ever confirmed, stood in silence for a long time, looking over the scene. Like he was remembering something he had buried a long time ago, and when he finally asked who was responsible, he didn't ask with anger or confusion, but with something else. Something close to recognition. She was sitting on a fallen tree rifle across her knees, face calm, eyes distant, as if she hadn't just killed 5 men, but had instead watched the trees grow and fall in silence. The commander approached her, slow, not cautious but respectful, like someone approaching a shrine. Not a soldier. He asked her a question, short, simple. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" And she looked at him. For the first time, really looked at him and gave him one word, a word that made his expression change, not in fear but in something deeper, something like memory. They never repeated the word. She said, not in the debrief, not in the report. It was redacted, classified, buried under layers of clearance levels above even the instructors. All they knew was that after that day, the commander began attending her drills, standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching, not judging, not scoring, just watching, and sometimes afterward he would say nothing for minutes, then ask her one question each day and she would answer always, short, always, exact. And the instructors began to realize he wasn't evaluating her, he was studying her. At the end of the second month, her squad was put through a live simulation with full contact rules, blank rounds, fog generators, timed movements, and a capture objective. But the fog was thicker than planned, and the radio comms went dark halfway through. And the opposition team had real gear, not blanks, not dummies. And somewhere in the chaos, one of the instructors started shouting across the channel for everyone to pull out, but not everyone responded. Because not everyone was still breathing. They found her again later just past the ridge, crouched low next to 2 wounded squad mates, her rifle aimed at the tree line, unmoving. She had not fired a single shot in that exercise, and yet the entire opposition team had called for extraction sighting. Unknown sniper presence, multiple simulated kills, and sudden cold fear that spread through their ranks like sickness. And when they pulled the helmet cam footage from one of the retreating men, it showed nothing, just shifting fog trees and one shadow that moved behind him so fast it was gone before the frame could adjust. After that day, She was not spoken of like a person anymore, but like an element, a force, a thing that happened on the battlefield and could not be explained or predicted, just endured. The instructors stopped grading her. The other shooters stopped comparing scores. The name at the top of the board was no longer hers, not because she had dropped, but because the board was wiped blank as if the measurement no longer applied, as if the metric itself had failed to contain what she was becoming. Then the wind changed, not just in the air but in the camp, in the eyes of the instructors, in the way her presence shifted rooms without her saying a word. She had become something, else something rare and raw and not entirely welcome, because what she represented was not success, but deviation, a path walked only by those who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. And when the commander called her into his office, for the final review, he did not ask her any more questions. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Once, she stood motionless, waiting for dismissal, and instead he handed her a coin, a small engraved token, not military, not official. Something older than both their uniforms combined, and said nothing else. But when she turned to leave, he spoke low and final. Not like an order, but like a truth you don't miss because you already know where they'll fall. She paused just for a second, and then disappeared into the hallway. Boots, silent rifle, slung breath steady, and somewhere in the distance the wind began to rise, carrying with it a warning that would reach every corner of the base, every corner of the battlefield, and every soldier who thought the best shooters all wore stripes or medals, because now they would whisper about the one who moved without sound and killed without pause, the one who carried the M24 like it was a promise, and the promise was always kept. They were already waiting when she stepped onto the platform, the sun breaking low behind her like the spotlight of some ancient trial, and the men in formation straightened without knowing why not, because they were ordered, not because they respected her rank. She had none but because standing there with the M24 on her back and her face like stone carved from cold earth, she looked like something that had been summoned, not trained, and the whispers that once followed her now gave way to silence thick enough to choke on the kind of silence that said, "We saw what you did, and we don't know what you are." The ceremony was for show. They all knew that a parade of fabricated speeches and polished boots lined up for the brass who wanted results and needed heroes, and she was the one they chose to pin the badge on because no one else could wear it without lying. The citation read, "For exceptional marksmanship and field discipline." But that was not the truth, and they all knew it, because there was no regulation for what she had done, no doctrine to explain it, and when the commander took the stage, there was a shift in the air, like the wind itself was listening. He didn't read from a script, didn't salute, didn't speak with the forced precision. They expected he just looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, and after a long pause he spoke, and every word carved itself into the minds of those listening, not because it was loud, but because it was true. He said there are shooters, and there are snipers, and then there is something else, something beyond the scope, something that cannot be taught or explained, only recognized and feared. And today we recognize it because to fear it would be to admit we cannot control it. He stepped forward and pinned the mark on her chest, a black insignia, not standard, not regulation, custom forged and sealed with the crest of his own unit. And when someone asked him later why he gave her that one, he only said, "Because she is the one you call." When the mission doesn't exist and no one ever asked again, and the mark became a ghost story worn by one and feared by all, because those who saw it never forgot what it meant. She said nothing, through it all, stood still as stone, and when dismissed, she didn't walk off like the others. She vanished into the wind again. No one saw her leave the stage, no one saw her exit the camp. It was as if she had never been there, and yet her absence hung heavier than her presence ever had. And for weeks afterward, her name remained on the board, not at the top, not at the bottom, but alone in its own space, untouched, unchallenged, unspoken, Rumors began to grow like weeds, fed by fear and fascination. Some said she had been recruited by a deep unit, something blacker than black that operated without name or flag. Others said she had never existed at all, that she was a psychological operation created to discipline overconfident recruits. But those who had stood beside her, who had followed her into the fog, who had seen the holes in enemy foreheads lined up like they were placed by a surgeon, they never doubted. The base itself changed. Drills became stricter instructors, quieter. The firing range gained a new name. Unofficially, they called it the graveyard, because no one wanted to shoot on her lane. No one wanted to line up against the ghost of her shots and miss in the same dirt where she had never once failed. And when new recruits asked why no one used that lane, the veterans just shook their heads and said, "You'll see, or maybe you won't," and left it at that. One day a sealed order arrived from high command. No explanation, just a time and coordinates and a name. And when the commander opened it and read the details, he closed the folder slowly and looked out the window for a long time, as if remembering a storm that had never ended. And when his aide asked if he would send the team, he said no, just her and nothing more. And by nightfall, the message had been relayed through silent channels, and no one dared to question the decision. She arrived at the drop point in darkness, no briefing, no backup, no exfil plan, just coordinates and a number 5 targets, high-risk priority eliminations, no margin for error. She lay in the dirt for 2 days, unmoving, watching through the scope as the wind shifted the grass, as the targets moved like ghosts, unaware that death watched them from the tall grass. And when the time came, the shots were not fired. They were placed like puzzle. Pieces slid into the world with purpose, each one a final sentence in a story that had ended before it began.